It was one of those rare moments that both reflected and molded the national character. Barely 4 years earlier, Americans had fought one another, north and south. In the Utah desert in 1869, they united the nation, east and west. The Transcontinental Railroad had become a reality. Perhaps only a nation of extraordinary energy and an unshakable belief in manifest destiny could have pulled it off. They had let nothing stand in their way, not the 1,800 miles between the Missouri River and Northern California, not the deserts and mountains, not the native tribes who had occupied the land for millennia. The cast of characters included people of the highest and lowest principles: businessmen, politicians, civil engineers, armies of laborers from Europe and Asia, and hundreds of pimps, prostitutes, and barkeeps. And when the railroad was done, ordinary Americans and immigrants would flood into the land. The railroad made the West and its place in the national imagination.
There were three main ways to get to California from the east before the railroad. The overland route typically struck out from some point along the mid-Missouri Valley, usually somewhere around Kansas City or St. Joseph, Missouri, went overland and across the Great Basin and finally across the Sierra Nevada.
Well, first of all, not a lot of people went to the West Coast at that point, and usually it was by the ocean. And that could be taking a sloop down to the Caribbean and walking across the Isthmus of Panama or across Nicaragua.
One was across Panama, and in 1855 a railroad was completed across Panama, all 48 miles of it, and literally it was the first transcontinental railroad in the Western Hemisphere.
The favorite method was the Shanks mirror, that is, walking. And in fact, you know, we look at these covered wagon caravans, and most of those people, in fact, walked that entire distance.
Now, the interesting thing about this trip is that the timing of it was absolutely crucial. It had to be timed to coincide with spring rains and high grass on the Great Plains because you needed it for your livestock. But you also needed to get over the Sierra before the winter snows set in. Some parties didn't make it. The most famous example, of course, was the Donner Party.
The trek across the country overland got progressively better, more organized, better serviced by way stations and, in some cases, forts for Indian protection. But at the very minimum, it took months of hard labor. You were lucky to make 10 miles a day. And the human toll and the toll on animals, and especially children and older folks, was just horrific.
A lot of interest in going across the country, and there was a lot of interest in people wanting to do it faster and faster. The railroad promised to do that. The problem was finding a route, and the problem was financing it.
The idea of building a transcontinental railroad in the U.S. dates back almost to the very beginnings of railroading in this country. As far back as the 1830s, people were dreaming of a railroad to the West Coast. There were a lot of reasons why that didn't happen. But by the 1850s, it was beginning to look like it could become a practical reality.
Because when Asa Whitney was putting forth his proposals in 1844, 1845, and thereon until 1851, the whole issue of slavery politically was getting more and more heated, and basically stalemated the whole process of sending the Transcontinental Railroad across the United States.
By the early 1850s, after we'd suffered some economic panics in the 1840s, when our industrialization, our first industrial revolution, was well underway, the pressure to at least explore the idea of a Pacific Railroad had grown so great that in 1853, Congress appropriated about $17 million, about $75 million in today's money, for what was called the Pacific Railroad Survey.
In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln enacted the Pacific Rail Act. This was to route a train across to the Pacific Ocean and offering land grants to the railroad companies.
And when it was finally approved by Congress, there wasn't much money because it was in the middle of the Civil War, and all the wealth of the country was going to fight the Civil War. Southerners wanted the railroad built one place, Northerners wanted the railroad built another place, and it was kind of a standoff, and nothing got done.
The Southern congressmen wanted to have a route that went along a southerly route in hopes that those territories and eventual states would become slave states. President Lincoln, of course, objected to this, as well as the northern congressmen. So that's why Lincoln established the more northerly route through Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and California.
So when the South left the Union, the legislators left in the U.S. Congress were all Northerners, and it was much easier for them to choose a northern route.
The other issue at that point was the Comstock Lode. That provided financial incentive for building a railroad across the Sierra, and so eventually it all coalesced fairly quickly on the central route. It was fairly clear that it was going to start from Sacramento because the Central Pacific Railroad already existed before Congress started dealing with this. On the eastern end, it wasn't quite clear, and so Congress, when they first came up with the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862, they actually create the Union Pacific Railroad. They didn't really pinpoint where construction was going to start. That was going to be up to the railroad itself. There were some issues with that. The first step in building a railroad is to figure out where you're going to put it. And that involves surveyors or engineers that go out and look at the land. And usually there's 3 different surveys. You start with a reconnaissance, where a small crew goes out and they cover a lot of country as fast as they can. They get a general look at the lay of the land. They identify what they call controlling points, which may be a mountain pass. It may be a place where they're going to cross a river. It may be where there's a town that they want to go to. And so they know they've got to build the railroad from this point to that point.
In 1853, Congress approved a measure to survey various transcontinental lines, and the Secretary of War, who was then Jefferson Davis, he sent out surveying parties to look at the practicability of a very far southern route, a couple of more middle routes, and then a far northern route, so all of the sectional interests of the nation were covered.
The first survey would be a field reconnaissance to find a general route to follow. The second survey would refine that and could include some significant changes in the actual alignment of the route. And then the third survey would be actually putting out the pegs for the actual construction. Each of those would have their own costs that would need to be funded. In doing surveys, it was important to have investors behind you who could fund at least preliminary surveys to determine possible routes. This was one of the things that Theodore Judah was doing, was trying to develop a group of investors who would back him to do the actual surveys.
Okay, Crazy Judah, they called him. His name was Theodore Judah, Theodore Dehone Judah, and he was the chief engineer in the early days of the Central Pacific Railroad. He had been fired with this passion for a Pacific Railroad from a very young age. Actually, as a young man, went to California and surveyed the very first railroad in the state, the Sacramento Valley Railroad. And that was really just a prelude to what he really wanted to do, and that was to survey a route through the Sierra Nevada for a railroad from California to the east. People thought he was crazy.
there was no business large enough to support a project of that magnitude. So the only option available was government support.
It was a way to underwrite construction of the railroad without actually laying out any cash. The federal government in the 1850s and 1860s, especially during the Civil War, was cash poor. So much of the cash went into fighting the war, fighting for the existence of one nation, the Union, that the thing that the government had most of was land.
So in government support, there were two types of support that the federal government gave. One was land grants. This was land that was given to the railroad in a checkerboard fashion, with the federal government retaining the other part of the checkerboard. This land could be sold by the railroad to raise funds. The second part was the federal government gave bonds that were guaranteed by the government that the railroad could then sell. But these are bonds, these are a loan, and in fact the railroads ultimately had to pay back these bonds with interest. The government in fact made a substantial profit by the end.
Now, the subsidy was not a grant. It was not a gift from the federal government. The subsidy was an amount that had to be repaid at a period of 30 years at a rate of 6%. So this was something that would haunt the railroads later. Also included in the act were land grants on either side of the tracks. But the land, which was provided for in alternating 1-mile sections, alternating with government land, first in 1862 was 10 miles on either side of the track, and then in 1864 was increased to 20 miles on either side of the track. That land was the railroads to sell as they needed to pay and to finance the construction of the railroad.
In many cases, too, it's worth noting that these lands really didn't have any practical value. They really weren't suitable for farming. Much of it had no mineral wealth and so forth. And so, yeah, it seemed like a good deal, and it was in fact a good deal, but it wasn't quite the sweetheart deal that many people have made it out to be.
And the thing was that the bonds that were paying them the money could not be applied for until the track was finished and continuous from the starting point.
The four executives at the center of the Central Pacific Railroad have been known almost since that time as the Big Four. They included Leland Stanford, who was the president of the railroad and simultaneously the governor of California. That I'll leave you to decide whether that was a conflict of interest. Charles Crocker was the gentleman who, he was a dry goods merchant, and he was the one who was responsible for construction.
Another fellow that is often overlooked was Ed Crocker, Charlie's brother. He was an attorney, he had been a judge, and he was also the only one of the group that had any civil engineering background. He had gone to Rensselaer Polytechnic and actually had a degree in engineering.
And then two hardware merchants from Sacramento who had been partners in a store also bought into the railroad. They were Mark Hopkins. He was the numbers man. He was the man who worried about the money and the ledgers and the bookkeeping. And then his partner, Collis P. Huntington. Collis P. Huntington was probably the sharpest, arguably the most avaricious of the four. And so those four were the driving force behind Central Pacific.
I would say that Collis Huntington was the engine that drove it, and that was primarily out east, selling securities, buying politicians, making the orders for all of the rolling stock that had to be shipped to California, because everything that made up the railroad had to be imported from the east, which meant every spike, every locomotive, everything but the railroad ties basically had to be imported at colossal expense. And so that was Collis Huntington's job, to scare all of that up and to try to figure out a way to pay for it.
Early early investors, Oaks and Oliver Ames of the Ames Shovel Company, were really instrumental in providing needed cash capital for the financing of the railroad. So the Ames brothers really provided support in cash infusions to the railroad to be able to get it built. And in fact, Oliver Ames became president of Union Pacific during the construction period, and then Congressman Oaks Ames was instrumental in providing additional support through the Credit Mobilier Corporation that was controversial but instrumental in creating the railroad Union Pacific.
Building the railroad was where the money was, because there were very few settlers in the West at the time. And so it wasn't profitable for the railroad. The money was in the building.
Now that's an interesting story that underscores a problem that Union Pacific had from almost the beginning, which was a problem of capital resources, how to finance this project. This was a beginning railroad. This was a brand new company. This was an endeavor that was supposed to take more than 14 years to complete instead of the 7 that it did. So initially, Union Pacific was struggling raising the needed capital to construct the railroad. So despite the subsidies and the land grants from the federal government, the railroad was struggling to make ends meet from almost the very beginning. Then Thomas Durant had a bright idea. He decided to borrow an idea from a French construction company called Credit Mobilier. And basically what this did was this allowed Union Pacific to circumvent the Pacific Railway Act and sell bonds and stocks and shares in Union Pacific at a price subpar to what they should have been sold for. This then allowed investors to recoup a dividend immediately instead of waiting for the completion of the railroad when the railroad actually started operating on a consistent basis. Oaks Ames, then serving in Congress, was asked by Abraham Lincoln to do all that he could to make sure that this project succeeded. So Oaks Ames, a director of Credit Mobilier as well as Union Pacific, started selling shares to fellow congressmen to finance the railroad. Now this investment seemed pretty safe to congressmen because they were controlling the fate of the railroad through the subsidies and then also reaping benefits through the dividend payments when this construction company was used to build the railroad.
It actually did the building, but the railroad had to pay the construction company, which then lined the pockets of the people who created this. And they also were involved in giving out bribes in Congress to get favorable treatment for the railroad.
So this became, by the time the railroad was completed, some 7 years after it had begun, the Credit Mobilier business had become quite a scandal, and eventually resulted in some very forceful government action being taken against the Union Pacific.
In all of these changes, especially in the 1850s, the United States is not alone. Things like this are happening all around the world. And I think it's useful to understand the Pacific Railroad project in a larger context, because Americans were very much aware of this other context. For example, in 1854, work begins on the Suez Canal in Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. In the very same way, the first transatlantic telegraph cable started construction in 1854. It was completed in 1858 after many unsuccessful trials. A third development, and these are game-changing, life-altering, world-changing developments, all happening in the 1850s and 60s, believe it or not, is the drilling of one humble little oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania.
The story begins in 1862, July 1st, when President Lincoln signs the Pacific Rail Act. It's in the middle of the Civil War. Things are, of course, all things are consumed by the war that nearly breaks the nation. And it isn't until later in earnest that the two companies, the respective companies, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, really start working. One of the things that interests me is just the numbers. And when you look at the miles across this vast continent. Altogether, it totals 1,776 miles. But when you separate them out, there's 1,086 miles for the Union Pacific, who clearly won that race. But then again, you have the Central Pacific, almost 700 miles across the Sierra Mountains.
We are here where the Union Pacific Railroad began, on the west banks of the Missouri River at Omaha, Nebraska. The first major event was a groundbreaking ceremony on December 2nd, 1863. Nothing happened more to the railroad due to the Civil War. By the first week in June of 1865, the actual construction of the railroad began in earnest. The first week of July, raw material began to arrive in earnest and was unloaded on the steamships here at the docks at the base of the river. On July 2nd, the locomotive arrived in parts. It came in crates and was assembled on the ground. It became locomotive number 1 and was eventually named the General Sherman. On July 10th, the actual iron rail began to arrive.
Well, I think the biggest challenge was it's just a hard effort. You know, to clear a pathway, they tried to follow kind of what we call the Mormon Trail. But laying rail through the plains and the desert is a hard thing under the best of circumstances. My gosh, that's almost a feat that's hard to comprehend back at that time.
The two biggest obstacles to building the railroad were the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. People didn't think you could actually build through those mountains. They're solid granite. So it took Theodore Judah, whose nickname was Crazy Judah, to convince 4 Sacramento businessmen that yes, you can build through these mountains.
But they still had the challenge of balancing the building between the metamorphic rocks that overlay the granite plus the granite, which is some of the hardest granite in the world. And they had to carve a roadbed out of that solid rock. And progress was very, very, very slow.
The Summit Tunnel, or Tunnel 6 on the Central Pacific, is really a fascinating place to visit. It's an unlined tunnel. It goes under Donner Summit. And an interesting thing about it is because it's unlined, you can actually see bore marks that the Chinese workers made still to this day, 150 years later.
And the Sierra was logistically and physically the most demanding part of that, because there's a stretch that leads up to Donner Summit where there are 12 tunnels in a matter of about 6 miles, including Tunnel 6, which at the time was the longest railroad tunnel being built in the world at 1,654 feet long. The process of building these tunnels is really arduous. It is in solid, very hard granite.
Nitroglycerin was so unstable that Central Pacific chose to only use it on the Summit Tunnel during that construction. Now, the construction of this tunnel is really fascinating because Central Pacific crews were working on this tunnel on 4 faces simultaneously. They were working from the east, they were working from the west, and they also drilled a shaft down from the top of the summit to meet the grade of the tunnel and were working backwards to the east and to the west. Amazingly, they met up and this tunnel was completed. Union Pacific, by contrast, had 4 tunnels to complete, all very difficult, but all used with traditional gunpowder.
Every one of those 15 tunnels could be considered a monument to the Chinese workers. There is one wall that is named after them specifically, and that's China Wall. It lies between Tunnel 7 and Tunnel 8. It's a very short distance, and China Wall sits right there. And I think it's really interesting that it's named in the honor of them.
The Transcontinental Railroad was built by hand. For the most part, all they had were hand tools. There were very few power equipment. The Union Pacific had some steam shovels, but the actual rail, the track laying was done as a hand operation. And what you see is a crew, when they started building the railroad, they started with a small crew, maybe just a dozen men laying the track. They would take a cart like this out to the end of track. It would be loaded with a row of rails. On top of that would be ties. They would take it out to the end of track, pulled by a horse or a mule. The crew would unload the ties, one at a time with 2 men per tie. They'd lay those ties down as far as they went, and then they'd start to take the rails off the car. The one thing that Jack Casement figured out, and he applied this first at the Union Pacific, was how to involve more people. In some cases on the Union Pacific, they were laying ties 40 miles ahead of the railroad, because in the Union Pacific, the ties were actually to the west of them, so they were bringing them back to the railroad.
So Jack Casement came up with a really innovative idea called the City on Wheels. And basically what this was a construction train about 40 cars long, and it had on board everything that they needed to construct 1 mile of track. Everything from the tools, the spikes, the fish plates, the rails, and the ties to do 1 mile of track. Now, the rail and the spikes were sited at the front of this train on flat cars. Each car had enough rail to lay 1 section of track. And after that was lifted off and put into place, that car was tipped off the rails, and the next car behind it was drawn forward by a horse.
On the Central Pacific, it worked the other way. They were taking the ties out to the end of track, but they would then use wagons to take them on ahead and lay them on the roadbed. The ties would be laid out. On the Central Pacific, they laid them out on 4-foot centers. Then the track laying crew would just bring rail on the cart. They would bring 16 rails. There would be a crew of 4 men in the front. 2 men would grab the end of each rail. They would roll those off. As the rail came to the roller at the end of the car, 2 other guys would grab that. They would set them down onto the ties. They would adjust them so they're at gauge, and then they would roll the cart with the rails that were still on it to the end of that rail. They would do the whole thing over again. When it was empty, they would push it back, tip it up on its side so they could bring the next loaded cart forward. On behind that was a team of guys that were doing nothing but bolting the rails together. Behind that, there were guys that were spiking, and they had that worked out to a system where one guy would start one spike, he'd just get it started, then he'd walk ahead to the next rail, do the same spike, do the same procedure. Someone behind him would hit that spike a second time. And so there's a whole army. There may have been 300 or 400 guys behind doing the spiking.
The organization of railroads has often been characterized as militaristic. That is to say, they're highly organized, highly regimented, very hierarchical, which is typical of a military organization. And so the employment of ex-army soldiers to build part of the UP was really a very good move. And of course, the construction was under the general supervision of General Dodge, who had been a Civil War general, and Jack Casement, who was another Civil War general.
The railroad companies were paid by the mile to really just put dirt on the ground, which we would call grade, and they were paid in land and cash, and so it was profitable for them to build the grade.
Now, the Pacific Railway Act also provided for subsidies per mile of track laid for both railroads. And these subsidies were graduated depending on what type of terrain the railroad had to traverse. So in the flats, it was $16,000. It went up slightly to $24,000 in the foothills, and then all the way up to $38,000 per mile in the mountains.
Hi, we're standing in the middle of the Transcontinental Railroad original grade. This is the Central Pacific grade, and we're in a cut that's right outside of the Big Fill, just below the summit at Promontory. The UP and the CP built parallel to each other in this area in hopes of winning more federal grants because they were paid by the mile. As they got to Promontory, as they got closer to each other, they actually passed each other in this area.
Because of the press of time, because of the interest in making as much money on it as possible, you had the ironic fact of basically having to rebuild just after something had been built, to keep bridges from washing out, to keep rails from sinking down into badly constructed rights of way. The driving of the Golden Spike was delayed by 2 days because of a bridge washout in Utah.
This is Bloomer Cut near the city of Auburn, and this was the first great engineering challenge of the Central Pacific Railroad. In 1864, building the line up here, they reached a need to cut through this hill on the Bloomer Ranch. And the gravels in this hill are cemented very tightly together, so tightly that they needed to use explosives, and this was a horrendous thing to cut through.
If you own an Ames shovel in your garden, you own a piece of Transcontinental Railroad history. Because the same people who were behind the Ames Shovel Company in those days, actually they made a fortune from the Civil War, and they made another fortune from the Transcontinental Railroad, because both enterprises required a lot of shovels.
One of my favorite places to visit on the entire Pacific Road, once again, is the Ames Monument in eastern Wyoming. It lies on the ridge. It was known as the Black Hills then, the ridge in between Laramie and Cheyenne. And at the apex of that ridge, it sat Sherman, a town. That was named for William Tecumseh Sherman, the highest point on the entire railroad between Omaha and Sacramento.
The challenges of building the Transcontinental Railroad were many. Construction was difficult from the get-go, but in the end, everyone was committed to making it happen. The Union Pacific was still building this cut just a few days before the completion of the railroad on May 10th, 1869.
Central Pacific began employing large numbers of Chinese, and it didn't happen immediately. Charles Crocker hit upon this idea of trying out a Chinese gang. There had been Chinese in California since the gold rush. Some of them had stayed. So Crocker worked with a Chinese contractor, got himself a crew of Chinese. He was widely scoffed at. His response was, well, they built the Great Wall, didn't they?
The Chinese crews for Central Pacific were hired on a little bit different labor scheme than the Irish crews for both railroads. So the Chinese crews for Central Pacific were hired on a per diem basis that did not include their room and board. So they were responsible for their own food, their own sleeping arrangements, etc. Now the Irish crews were provided food and board by the railroad, which could mean a tent or a hammock and some beef, beans, and water. The Chinese crews, on the other hand, were importing their own foodstuffs, their own cooks, and creating their own camps alongside the track.
And they have a special diet. Yeah, they work 6 days a week. Then on Sunday, they have a train from California. One day they can go to shop, they can buy any kind of food they buy.
The Chinese had a very, very good diet, and we have in fact, we eat some of their foods now, and a key to their good health or staying healthy was the fact they drank boiled water in the form of tea.
At the time of the construction of these railroads, there wasn't the kind of emphasis or awareness on health that there is today. And so people would drink water out of ditches and out of wells and so forth with no testing. And I guess if the water was liquid enough that it didn't crunch as it went down, it was good to drink.
Oh, the biggest challenge working on the railroad, for my opinion, it is the environment and the work condition. Because most of the railroad workers is from southern China, the Guangdong province, that's where my ancestors are from, where they never have snow. They didn't experience snow at all. So you can imagine it's so difficult for them to get adjusted to. So while they're working in the Sierra Nevada, and there's a harsh winter.
While they were up at the top of the Sierra building this gargantuan effort, the Chinese did attempt to strike. They wanted to be paid $35 a month, the same as the white workers. And they threatened to strike, and they actually put down their tools for a little bit. Charlie Crocker, who was the construction foreman, would have none of this. And he quickly came up there. He habitually carried an axe handle with him as a visual reinforcement of how tough he was. And he made it real clear that as long as they didn't work, that no food would be coming, no trains would run, there was no way that they could return to Sacramento. And he quickly broke that strike.
Remember when one day they did lay 10-mile track, and one day they were working with the Irish. Irish was putting the planking down. The Chinese would liking it. So they made that 10 mile a day. So they did work with some Irish.
And the Irish were readily available. A number of Irishmen had come over and fought in the Civil War. When the war ended, they had certain skills that they were able to bring to bear on the railroad.
The bulk of the workers on the UP were Civil War vets. Many of them Irish, but there were other Eastern Europeans as well, and some African Americans. The other way, the Central Pacific was mostly run under the backs of the Chinese. The deal was that the Irish were hard drinkers, fighters. The Chinese mostly kept to themselves, ate well, didn't drink, and so it was interesting, the contrast between the two, and they all worked hard.
Hell on Wheels is a term coined for the camp followers that followed the railroad mainly at the end of the line during construction. So as the railroad proceeded further west, the campers would pull up their tents and follow along. And of course, these campers were there to provide entertainment for the workers.
The towns along the way came to be known as Hell on Wheels, partially because they were terrible places. I mean, the railroad workers were making $3 a day and nowhere to spend their money because they were out in the middle of Wyoming or Nebraska or wherever. And so entrepreneurs were smart enough to say, well, we'll just establish these towns, which mostly consisted of casinos and whorehouses and saloons. And when the railroad would stop, either because they ran out of supplies or the weather, these towns would pop up and would be there as long as the railroad was. When the railroad moved on down another 100 miles, they would pack up all of these storefronts on the railroad, on flat cars, and go to the next stop and rebuild it all again.
Hell on Wheels towns are, I think, an apt description for a lot of the railroad camps that grow up as workers are building the lines of the railroad coming from west to east and east to west. And one of the more famous ones in Utah is the town of Corinne, which becomes quite populated with a number of churches of different types, but with more gambling halls, saloons, places where prostitution is, just rough and tumble type places.
These towns must have been awful. Murders, people being strangled in daylight for their wallets, and of course, untold amounts of drinking and gambling. And it went on 24 hours a day.
Brigham Young and those early Mormon pioneers came here to find refuge and kind of get away from persecution. So they're here in 1847. So now we're here in 1867, 68, building a railroad. And again, I think that brought in fact, opportunity for them to be less isolated, be a part of the country. It certainly was the junction point for the connection between the East and the West.
Brigham Young was directly involved, and he was from very early on. In 1852, the territorial legislature of Utah sent a petition to the federal government asking that the railroad be built and be built speedily, and that it come through Utah. Brigham Young also was very enthusiastic in 1854 after meeting the first surveying party that came into Utah. After meeting them, he wrote to Stephen Douglas, who was a powerful senator of Illinois. He wrote and suggested that the best route through Utah would be through Provo Canyon.
In May 1868,
You had people from the Union Pacific Railroad begin to contact Brigham Young about the possibility of hiring Mormons to work on the grading of the railroad, particularly in Utah. Brigham Young signed a contract with the Union Pacific toward the end of that month. And then on June 11th, 1868, he held a meeting to tell all of the Mormons about what he had decided. One of the reasons that Brigham Young originally wanted to have Mormons participate in building the railroad was to ensure that some of the groups that were building the railroads in other areas didn't come to Utah.
When they got to Utah, the Mormons looked askance at the railroad workers. They were evil, they drank, they womanized, they were loud, raucous. The Mormons didn't want any part of them, but financially they saw an opportunity. They wanted the line to go to Salt Lake, it didn't. Went through Ogden.
When the railroads entered Utah, the Union Pacific made a deal with Brigham Young to supply labor, and mainly for the Union Pacific. And they began working shortly after the railroad entered Wyoming, if not before, and helped grade and lay track down through Echo Canyon and Weber Canyon and into the Ogden area. And furthermore, they went north to the city of Corinne and all the way to Promontory.
In that desperate race between the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, and the need for speed and the need for the Central Pacific to beat the UP into Weber Canyon and its coal deposits, they brought in many more Mormon laborers.
And the benefit to the Mormon people, as we've mentioned, is economically, bringing capital and convenience to the state of Utah. But 5,000 Mormons worked on the railroads. So they had the opportunity to get good jobs, get paid money, and help, again, grow the economy of Utah by this job opportunity that they were given.
Native American tribes were negatively affected by the railroad. Look at the introduction of the railroad as an epidemic in Indian country, similar to smallpox. So the tribes were taking a defensive position against the railroad because there were times where the railroad construction abrogated treaty. The treaties are considered the highest law of the land, so it may be in the context of the Treaty of 1851 or the Treaty of 1868.
For Union Pacific, one of the biggest challenges surveyors had, in addition to the weather, supply deprivation, and just really general hard work, was attacks by Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho war parties. These groups of indigenous peoples had been moved about by the U.S. Army, they had been treated with, treaties had been pulled back, and they really saw the railroad as an incursion into their territories.
I would say that all the Western Indian tribes but one had absolutely no interest in supporting or making way for the progress of the railroad, which would be bringing, of course, civilization, Eastern civilization would be bringing new towns springing up every 10 miles along the right-of-way of the train, cutting off the buffalo paths.
So the buffalo was nearly exterminated, and the railroad played a part in that. Absolutely, there were attacks. I would say they were more like skirmishes rather than attacks. The period of time during the construction of the railroad, once again, was done in the context of in between treaties, and so there was organized, disorganized, there was a clash of cultures, definitely.
The Indians, of course, were not thrilled with the coming of the railroad, but then they weren't thrilled with the coming of the white man. You know, they were essentially invading their homeland, and so they were not at all reluctant to resist and attack the whites who were coming. At one point, one of the Indians wondered whether there were any white people still left east of the Mississippi. because so many were coming out west.
Thomas Durant with the UP built 6 miles in one day of railroad track, and they were quite proud of that. But Charles Crocker of the CP said he could do better. So he got a gang of Irish and Chinese workers, and they actually built 10 miles in one day. And Crocker and Durant had made a bet with each other, and of course Crocker won.
Yes, it was a bet. I mean, everything was show, everything was drama with the railroad. Newspapers were following just every move that was made, and there was a lot of money to be made. So there was what you might call a carnival atmosphere that was going on.
And they, on the Central Pacific, they laid 6 miles of track in one day. After that, the Union Pacific laid 7. It became a contest between these two companies. Well, Crocker wasn't dumb, so he waited until they were within 14 miles of Promontory, and he laid out all the equipment, all the supplies. They were going to lay 10 miles of track in one day, and he was going to prove that they could do it. And they had waited until the Union Pacific was too close to Promontory, so they couldn't one-up them.
Strobridge and Crocker were very clever. They spent a week or more positioning ties all along the proposed route, getting the Chinese laborers, led by 8 Irish construction bosses, excited about the prospect of making this record.
We're standing on the grade of the Transcontinental Railroad just west of the summit at Promontory. For a project that was amazing in so many ways, this was a place that was truly incredible. This is where they built 10 miles of track in one day, a record that's never been eclipsed.
Promontory did happen. On May 10, 1869, both railroads met and laid the last rail, the last tie, and had a ceremonial presentation of several unique, beautiful commemorative spikes that day. This is one of those spikes. This is the Arizona spike. This was presented by the Arizona Territory to Union Pacific in honor of the completion of the railroad. Now, the final spike, or the last spike, which was made of gold, was given to Leland Stanford, president of Central Pacific, on that day. And this spike was engraved with an interesting date. It was engraved with May 8, 1869. Why the difference? Everyone was in place, everyone was waiting, everyone was there, except for Union Pacific Vice President Thomas Durant. Thomas Durant's train on the way to Promontory was actually hijacked by Union Pacific employees wanting to get paid before they would let him pass. He arranged payment for them, and pass he did, and then the ceremony took place on May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah.
The car behind me is the only relic left from the gold spike ceremony at Promontory, Utah in May 1869, other than the gold spikes. Of all the rolling stock that was there, this car was there as Crocker and Stanford's private car. It was the business car of the Central Pacific Railroad. This is the car that Stanford used to carry the spikes and the special tie made out of laurel wood back to Promontory.
I think the Transcontinental Railroad connected the people of America together. That connection was significantly important, particularly at a very divisive time. So it connects the East to the West, and that was the number one factor. But along with doing that, it provided economic opportunity to grow the economy and provide jobs, economic expansion. So convenience and connection, but economic opportunity really are the benefits that you get with the Transcontinental Railroad.
The Transcontinental Railroad is such a, it just is like at the heart of our history. It's at the heart of Chinese American history, and it means an incredible amount of, it has so much significance to me, being a descendant of a railroad worker.
The gold spike at Promontory, Utah in 1869, and the spike here at Strasbourg the next year, 1870, monument over here. Let's look at both of these events and see what significance each of them had. First of all, transcontinental, if you look it up in the dictionary, the word means across the continent. It doesn't specifically state a starting point and an ending point. The concept of the first unbroken line of rails from Atlantic to the Pacific is a little bit different definition there.
In Strasburg, Colorado, there was a final joining of direct rails that completed, in many people's mind, the Transcontinental Railroad. The route via Omaha was incomplete because there was a ferry ride at Omaha across the Missouri River, and people argue that this breaks the Transcontinental Railroad.
The so-called Hannibal Bridge in Kansas City was the first bridge over the Missouri River, any place along the entire river. And it was completed in 1869 on the 4th of July, so just a couple of months after the first Transcontinental Railroad was finished. And the interesting thing about the first Transcontinental line is that it did not bridge the Missouri at Omaha and Council Bluffs, Iowa, until a few years later.
The way it started out, you know, not to downgrade Promontory Point about any of their, you know, celebrations or any of that. It's the wording of the way it goes. And the Denver Pacific Railroad, which was being created with John Evans and personnel, was building trackage to Cheyenne to meet up with Union Pacific at that point, while the Kansas Pacific was building trackage headed for Denver.
It was sad news for Denverites when the Transcontinental Railroad decided not to build through Denver and over the Colorado Rockies, but a much gentler route through Wyoming, and to make Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, their Rocky Mountain regional headquarters. At that point, Denver begins losing population. Many people move up to Cheyenne, figuring that's going to be the rail hub, that's going to be the boom town. Denver is going to die without a railroad.
On August the 15th, 1870, the Kansas Pacific and the Denver Pacific met here. This is the place. There was like a keg of whiskey out there for the victors of the whole thing. The losers, I don't know if they ever did share into it.
It's, first of all, the oldest operating railroad under its same name that we have. Every other early railroad has been merged or gone out of business or has changed. But this has been the Union Pacific Railroad since basically the passage of the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862.
But the Union Pacific speaks of the Union that Lincoln talked about, that he was trying to preserve, and then the Pacific is the destination.
Well, it's a unique name because it's Union, which we consider the Union to the Pacific, and they've always been able to maintain that name. It's I think it's probably a good part of it is because of the uniqueness.
One of the small ironies that I see today is Union Pacific handles a great deal of Oriental traffic coming from Asia going to the Midwest or East Coast in exactly the same way that Asa Whitney envisioned in 1845 when he made his persuasive argument for a transcontinental railroad.
The close connection that the Union Pacific has with heritage goes back to 1862 and the Pacific Railway Act and President Abraham Lincoln. Few corporate structures today are intact the way the Union Pacific is.
Well, the big boy is one of the core components of the locomotive fleet back in the steam era. A big machine of that size was needed to reduce congestion and to perform the vital work of actually moving the freight. Prior to the conception or the development, the design, and the delivery of the big boy locomotive, they had locomotives that weren't quite as big and powerful, therefore they required more locomotives to do that given amount of work.
The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad with the driving of the Golden Spike in 1869 really united our country. And it made possible what was then a great future, which is the great present of our country today. The Transcontinental route today is still a vital link to commerce in our country, and is still key to what we are and where we're going as a country.
An amazing feat of human will and engineering, but not without its faults.
It was a spectacular undertaking, and it took a lot of people to build the thing. And, you know, people like Thomas Durant, who was one of the main forces behind getting it built, was one of the prime movers behind it. And it was really, it seemed like an impossible project when they started.
This magnificent accomplishment was the moonshot of the 19th century.
It's been called a work of giants, but really when you look at it, it was a work of common people.